So my name is Lucy Starbuck Braidley and I work for the National Literacy Trust. I'm Programme Manager for Reading for Enjoyment. I've been in the role for about 6 months now, but before that, the 10 years before that, I was a primary school teacher, working in Key Stage 1 and Key Stage 2, an English lead. And over that time, I really started to love using comics in the classroom. And since leaving the classroom, I've developed that a little bit more. I've had a chance to work, really exciting chance to work with the Beano on some resources for National Literacy Trust and some other things on our website. And we're going to look at some resources links later on. So I've been able to carry on that love of reading comics and using comics for teaching, which has been really exciting. And I'm joined by Richard, who's going to introduce himself, who's an absolute powerhouse of knowledge when it comes to graphic novels. So really excited to have him.
So my name is Richard Ruddick, and I'm currently a Year 6 teacher in Norwich. I've taught Key Stage 2 all my life, but over the last probably 5 years, I've done a heavy focus on using comics as part of my English teaching and just in generally developing a reading culture at my previous school. And then I started running a blog detailing some of the work that I've been doing, some of the highs, some of the lows, and generally just spend a lot of my time on Twitter sort of promoting books that I think benefit the classroom or can benefit children's written work.
And we've got a bit of a plan to go to talk a little bit about the theory around how comics can support reading, a little bit about the theory of how to analyse comics in so that you might want to use in lessons. And we've got some recommendations of great starting points if you want to start expanding your collection of graphic novels in school. And we've also got some sort of practical classroom ideas. So that's really what we're aiming to cover in our session today. So I was going to start off by looking a little bit about, there's a bit of a perception in the population in general, but I think particularly in schools, it's starting to shift. I think, Richard, you agree, perception about using graphic novels has definitely changed over the last few years.
Significantly in the last 2 or 3 attitudes have changed, I would say. Yeah,
so I think there's starting to be a shift, but there's definitely still sort of a nagging perception that comics are easy, that they're still, even when they're used a lot in schools, I often see people referring to them as being good for reluctant readers, which I agree they are, but there's more to them than that, and they can actually be really useful for all different levels of attaining readers. So what are some of where does that perception come from? That's what I really want to explore just to start us off. And actually there's loads of really embedded meaning reasons why we think of image-based text as being simple. So part of the fact that, you know, using sequential images to tell a story is very, very something that was developed really early on in like the history of humankind. We see it in cave paintings, we see it in tapestries, the Bayeux tapestry there. And it's something that developed in lots of different places at once. So it wasn't something that started in one place and then spread across the globe. It was something that was innate, and it was a type of language that developed spontaneously. So it's something that's been around for a long time, and it's something that was before written language. So we think of it as being simpler than written language because of that. Another reason could be that it's often used to transcend sort of language barriers and to try and make instructions universal. So we have sequential images in things when we get our furniture from IKEA, for example. But that is one of the things where you can start to think, well, actually, maybe it isn't as easy to follow what's meant by a sequence of images as we think it is, because there's been plenty of times where I've really struggled to make a simple piece of furniture following instructions from somewhere like IKEA. So although we think of a sequence of images as being something that can be universally understood, actually there's a fluency there, and there's something that we need to learn how to do that, and it's something that is developed over time and through exposure as well. And another reason why I think sometimes they're thought of as not being for school, or certainly why they have been in the past, is because a lot of classic comic books sort of existing outside as a kind of counterculture. They're telling stories, they're popular with young people, they're not happening from inside the sort of hallowed ground of the literary culture. There's something that's happening outside of that culture historically. And still there still is an underground element to making of comics that goes on. And I think that actually that is one of the things that really appeals to children or people, adults, humans, because they like the fact that it's not mainstream. So that can be actually, although that's one of the reasons why the establishment sometimes think of them as easy, it can be actually one of the things that really makes them, as for reading for pleasure, a really great resource to have, because children aren't threatened by them and they think that they're cool. So I wanted to know, really, are comics easy? Do we learn to read from comics? And I found some information out from various places. I'm just going to take you through a couple of slides. So, and actually, I found this link to this research from a really great podcast, The Portable Magic Dispenser, which is Lucas Maxwell's podcast. If you don't listen to that, there's a link to that in our little references at the end. And his librarian has so many ideas. And one of his episodes is about making a Comic-Con at school. And he found this research from professors at California State University, and they were comparing the language that college graduates use in discussions, oral language, and they found that as a benchmark of people with good vocabulary, people who use rare words, who use that sort of tier 3 vocabulary. So he found that language used by comics, they found that language used by comics is more advanced than that used by college graduates in oral communication. It uses almost twice as many rare or difficult words. And although the word count is lower, which is another reason why I think people think they're easy, because it's lower, because you're so restricted on space, actually you find the language is really carefully chosen in a graphic novel or a comic. It's selected with real purpose and intent. And so actually you've quite often find that it does have some challenging and unusual vocabulary, which is really good for all readers. So they found that it used twice as many rare or difficult words, and that it was often using more challenging language than classic children's literature. And there's a link to that research there. Another little piece of research, just before we get into our recommendations. Neil Cohn is a visual linguist, and really fascinating, lots and lots of books about how we understand comics. And so I wanted to find out the answer to this question: do comics improve our reading skills? So I emailed him and asked him, because I thought he'll be the person that knows. And he said they do improve the reading of words, because the more we practice reading words, the better we get at it, the more fluent we get. So of course, if you read comics, you are going to become more fluent because you are reading when you're reading comics. But he said to me that really I was asking the wrong question, because it was not just about reading words. When you're reading a comic, you're decoding 3 types of language. You're decoding the written words, if it's got words in it. We're making that assumption here. Some of them are wordless comic books or graphic novels. But you're also decoding the visual language embedded in the picture. What does that mean? In that picture, what messages, what am I supposed to be able to infer from the single image, each panel as you read it? And there's a third type of language, which is the language of the sequence of images itself. When I put one image next to another, now what's the meaning? What has happened between those two? What's changed between those two? Have I changed place? Is there a consistency there? Is there something the same, or is there something different? Why have I moved on to another frame? And understanding how to read the sequences of images and what they mean is another type of fluency that's needed to read comics and graphic novels. So it means that when we're reading them, we're not just doing one type of reading, we're actually doing 3 types of reading, and reading comics and graphic novels improves the fluency. And some really important other things, takeouts from his book, Who Understands Comics, which I found really useful or really interesting, was that children begin to understand sequential images between 4 and 6 years old. So most of our recommendations, in fact, I think all of our recommendations, Richard, later on are Key Stage 2.
Yes, I'm pretty sure they
maybe some top end of Key Stage 1.
I do be on that cusp as they transition sort of up
yeah,
Key Stage
exactly.
1 to lower Key
and that
Stage
tends
2.
to be, I think, where they tend to sit, because of that need for understanding. And I was sort of reminded when I read that about my son reading a Maisie book, and there's writing on one page and a picture on the other page the whole way through. And then when we got to the middle, suddenly Maisie's inside a shop buying some toys, and you see her at all the different parts looking at, or the shop looking at the toys, and that just completely, he just was like, Maisie, there's 10 Maisies. To him, it wasn't the same Maisie in different places, because he hadn't developed the understanding of how to read a sequence of images. To him, in a huge plot twist, Maisie had multiplied into 10 Maisies once she went inside the shop. And that really illustrates how we need to learn to read sequential images, and it develops throughout that early years in Key Stage 1. But children who are exposed to more comics and graphic novels learn how to read them earlier, and they can produce them into far more advanced level earlier as well, the more they read them. So for example, in cultures where comics and graphic novels are more central part of the culture, for example in Japan, it's much more widespread, they are able to decode sequences of images much earlier, and they're able to produce their own comics much earlier to a higher standard and much more complexity than we tend to see in England, because of the difference in exposure. But in order to understand them, you need to have all three levels of these understanding. So that is why it might particularly help somebody who perhaps has a weaker word decoding, if their visual language decoding abilities and their ability to decode the sequence is stronger, that will prop up any problems that they have with reading of words. But it can go the other way as well. So if someone's very, very proficient at reading words but hasn't had that exposure to sequences of images, then they might find it actually more challenging. We tend to think of comics to be for those lower attaining readers, but actually higher attaining readers can be just as challenged and especially if they're taught different ways to read them, which we'll look at a little bit later on as well. So also regular comic reading is going to improve all three of those strands. So it's a really good thing to build into children's diets and encourage them, have them available for reading for pleasure. Okay, so we're going to move on to some really interesting recommendations. If you want to expand the amount of graphic novels that you've got in your collection at school or at home, if you just want a starting point. If you do want to drop a question, an answer into the chat, we've got a question here. If you want to share some of your own recommendations, we'd love to hear about your recommendations. I'm always on the lookout for more things to read. So Richard, you're going to take us through some of these and I'm going to chip in when I've got.
Yeah. So I'm going to go through some more recent ones that have been popular. There is other ones that are available, but these are the ones at the moment in the current climate that I think are doing really well in classrooms. So I'm going to start off with Lightfall. Now, this is a recent release, and I would argue it's inspired by classics along with Lord of the Rings. Things like Dungeons and Dragons and stuff like that. There's a lot of influences in there, which obviously is becoming more popular again at the current moment. In a nutshell, it's a really exciting book, basically, from the start to the end, off on a quest. You've got a slightly comical, lovable fish man as one of the characters. You've then got the upset and scared nature of the main character, which shows it's okay. You can be heroic and still have these concerns. And it just kind of grabs readers and takes them the whole way through this beautiful and vivid world. And then at the end, you're just left begging for more. And I always think it's really big and popular with those children who love reading the Amulet books, which are very popular. It's kind of like the new one to take over that. And there's a sequel coming out next year, which I think means it's going to be more and more essential as time goes on and the universe builds.
When we did our run through of this, I hadn't read this and I ordered it. Oh my word, I am blown away by it. Honestly, I cannot, the illustrations are exquisite. It's like, there's this film called Days of Heaven, where they shot the whole entire film the hour before sunset, and that's what this book is like. It's just like the whole book has been made the hour before sunset. The quality of the light through the leaves. I want to go there on holiday. I want to live. I've stopped reading it because I can't bear to leave that place. Honestly, I love it.
It is one of those, definitely.
Yeah, it's beautiful, and some really interesting things, like you were saying about the way that in the image the anxiety is represented, and without spoiling it for anyone, and yeah, just lots of really interesting things going on in there to discuss, as well as just to enjoy, just to relish. Absolutely loved it. Next one.
Okay, Guts. Now, when I put this on there, there's like a cheat almost as well, in that I'm saying any book written by Raina Telgemeier is worth having, but this is the one I've named. But everything she does is so popular across Key Stage 2, but Year 5 and 6 especially, because a lot of them are semi-autobiographical, or they're kind of based around other people's issues, if not, that might be happening at that time. Like, she rewrote the Babysitters Club, so a lot of that obviously is based around things that are happening as you're sort of going into adolescence. And she just explores themes that lots of people are going through, but don't realize that they're not the only one, or don't realize other people are in the same position as them. And Guts is a really important one because it explores anxiety, which is becoming more and more recognized and dealt with in society. And it just kind of, it really not glorifies, but makes it okay. It makes you realize how normal it is to be worried about things, and actually how if you avoid it, or you try and hide it, or you try and pretend you don't have that, you make it worse. And the only way you can truly help yourself, either accept it, maybe resolve it, or just find it easier, is to speak to people, or to get that guidance, or just simply say, this is what happens. Don't even necessarily have to do anything about it, but you just almost empower it. And I found in my class, lots of children, and it was particularly girls in the class I had at the time, said, this is me. They were like, I've been actually feeling like this, and now I feel okay to talk about it. And it's just really important for making us realize we've all got stuff going on. It's all right. Like, don't be afraid.
I agree. I think, Raina Telgemeier books have really been popular in my classrooms as well. And again, with a real, not necessarily with children who see themselves at that point as graphic novel readers, but as a really good entry point, is just because the human nature of the story and the connections that they can have as a reader. I think they're all really, really strong books.
Okay, The Cardboard Kingdom. I wish I had my copy with me, because it's so battered from being read so many times. But I always say to the class, this shows you how good this book is. It starts off really simply, which is basically the premise of some children on the street playing together in their summer holidays in America. And then each chapter focuses on a different child who's in the game, and you start to find out what their problem is in life, or what's maybe bothering them, what's going on, and how somehow they're seeking for the game to resolve that, or they're seeking a distraction potentially. And it really just highlights how everyone's going through something different, or everyone has something that's bothering them. And it covers things that are really common. So divorce is a big one. Obviously, lots of children have to deal with that. Social issues such as making friends, or people's perception of you. So there's a big bit on the bully about how he thinks he has to be seen as this scary person, because he thinks that's what his identity is. And then it moves on, delicately on some more difficult topics for some people, like sort of self-identification and how they identify with their gender. But it does it all in a really sensitive way, where it doesn't make light of anyone. It doesn't, undervalue those ones. It just says, this is what some people are dealing with. This is how they might cope with it, or this is what it might feel like. And it just, again, it empowers the reader to realize either A, they're not alone, or B, actually, it's okay to have something that's bothering you. Go and speak to your friends about it, or realize we've all got something. And for that reason, it's a really must-have for Key Stage 2, because not only is it a brilliant story, there's so much you can do with the PSHE side of things, even just by reading it, let alone just unpacking it, that it really will help. There's going to be someone in your class who's going to benefit from it.
I haven't read this one, and it's definitely going onto my to be read list. Definitely. You're costing me money, Richard.
I get told that a lot.
I bet you do.
So here's another one which I'll add my must-have tag to. This one is based on real life, which I think makes it so powerful, and it's such an emotional story. It's regularly won either people who say, I don't like graphic novels, but I liked this one, or I now feel I can read them. And it also has the moniker attached to it heavily of that book made me cry. So it came out, I think it was last year, and I don't think I can do my words true justice of it, but basically it looks at the real life story of Omar Mohammed and his brother growing up in a refugee camp, unaware if their mother is still alive. They're sort of sent there by themselves, and they're just trying really hard to get out of the camp and get themselves what they think is like a fresh start. And the dream is to go to America. And as they go through, they're there for a long time. It's not a quick fix, and it really highlighted to me how ignorant I was to the way refugee camps work and all the political sides involved with it. But it just takes you on this really powerful journey, and I think a lot of children who've read it have really realized how lucky and privileged they are in many ways, but also it's just resonated with them that when we see things on television, this is what's going on behind the scenes. And it just, well, it's truly kind of breathtaking in parts. So I think any class in year 6 certainly should not only have it, but they should really be reading it as part of their kind of curriculum work at some point.
I love this book, and also the sibling relationship. It just really brings home sort of the humanity and the reality that actually people living in refugee camps are exactly the same. You know, they are humans and go through the same emotions and are feeling how we would feel if we were there. So I think, yeah, a really powerful book.
So this has been a really successful book in the last sort of 6 to 8 months. I would go as far to say possibly the most popular book in my class last year. And part of the good thing about this book actually doesn't have necessarily the happy ending everyone will want. It's not a like traumatic one, but actually, you know, the message is that you can't always have what you want, but you can, you know, make the most of what you've got. And the premise is simple in that, you know, what do you do if you want a dog, but you find out you're allergic to it? And it looks at so much after that, though. So it looks at the idea of how do you solve that problem? How do you go around it? And then it explores onto how that has a knock-on effect on people around you, such as family issues, social issues, and the idea of when you're growing up and you're moving to a new school, particularly, so this age, it would be the kind of year 6 to year 7. Over in America, I think it's maybe a year later. But that idea of as you move up to that, what's going to happen, the problems that come up with friends, how they change, how you maybe change or you don't change, and that's what seems strange. And it just covers all these really important messages that come with growing up, but it all starts with that really kind of basic premise of, well, I want a dog and I can't have one. And all this other stuff comes out of it quite naturally. And it really helped a lot of children in mine realize sometimes with their friendships what was going on, or perhaps what they needed to prepare themselves for as they moved up. And it really struck a chord with a lot of readers.
I haven't read that one either. Also need to get a hold of that one, I think. Sure.
Mr. Wolf's Class, which is a slightly slightly lighter one than perhaps some of the ones we've had, which is nice. And this is a good one for all of Key Stage 2, and also for adults, because it's written by an actual teacher. So everyone who reads it, certainly if you work in education, has got someone in there they can identify with. From the children, having the kind of like, there's a few cheeky chappies in there. There's a couple of people who come across quite strong-willed, but it's actually kind of insecurities or passion about certain things. At times, there's some quite inept teaching from Mr. Wolf, and I won't lie, I've identified with certain parts of it at certain times. Or you've sat there and thought, oh yeah, I remember thinking that was a great idea and it didn't work for me either. And basically all the stories are told through these kind of anthropomorphic characters. And as they go through, there's 4 books so far, number 5 is on the way. They cover loads of different things and loads of different scenarios in just a really nice, relatable way for children that's not only enjoyable and fun to read, but actually still has a little bit of a message. So they cover things like friendship, bullying. There's a bit of covering on like one of the children's parents are the same gender, so there's a little bit to do with sexuality. There's a bit on climate change, but again, none of it's done like preaching a message or anything. It just does it as part of the story and just shows you, here's what someone might be thinking, here's what you might be, and really nicely and sort of covertly deals with it in a way that can help people learn.
And really normalizing as well.
Yeah.
Sounds really good. Haven't read that one either.
That is a must read. So some honorable mentions. These are ones that have been quite popular, and a couple of these will be more suitable for that kind of upper Key Stage 1, lower Key Stage 2 bracket. So Amulet is only on here because that's the one I always mention, so I'm trying to branch out, but that is
I love Amulet. Oh, but it's so good. Especially
year 5 and 6. If you've got those children, I don't want to call them reluctant readers, but perhaps less confident, or they just don't know what they like reading, this is usually a really good bet to get them interested, because it's quick, it's to the point, but there's enough story to keep them hooked in. The Narwhal books, they're great for Key Stage 1, but children in Key Stage 2 all the way up absolutely love them still, because they're just a bit silly and a bit fun. But again, they've got lots of lovely messages about friendship and kind of supporting each other in them. At times I found them as popular in year 6 as with 6-year-olds, so they have really good versatility. Sparks is always a good one for that kind of I'd say midpoint, like year 4 is particularly where this one I think can shine. Basically, you've got 2 cats pretending to be a dog, and they end up going around like fighting crime and things like that. So it's a little bit silly, but the vocab in it's really good, and it it tells a story very well and shows that kind of that way of delivering a story slightly differently that some children struggle. The Investigators, this has been a recent sort of smash hit, like does the rounds, so popular. I had to have 2 to 3 copies of every book last year because I couldn't keep them on the shelf quick enough. It's sometimes seen people that say, oh, that just looks like Dogman, but it's what I would call a more sort of intelligent version of Dogman almost. Like it's got a wider variety of vocabulary in it. There's a lot more things like puns and wordplay in there for them to work out. So it's a bit like a successor to Dogman when children have read that. And it's just really popular again across all of Key Stage 2. Strong readers in lower Key Stage 1 might be able to deal with it, but some would find it quite tricky still. But definitely Key Stage 2 across is really popular. And then the last one is Stepping Stones, which I think has been so well read in my class because it has a very, again, it's semi-autobiographical and it has a really understandable and relatable story for some children, where basically it's about blended families and the merging of 2 families, both from divorce becoming a new family, and the kind of trials and tribulations that can bring in, not necessarily someone doing something wrong, but how that can make the children involved feel and how they deal with that. And I think for some children, they really need to see that in a book to make them realize they're not the only ones going through that.
Yeah, for sure. Those are really good ones to add. I think as well, Joe Todd Stanton books are a good one for Key Stage 1, just to start getting children used to those sequences of images as well, like the Brownstone family books. I would really recommend those as well for a Key Stage 1 sort of starter. Right, I'm just looking at time. I think we need to probably move a little bit quicker through our next section, but it's fine. So we've got some practical classroom ideas now, things that we've both tried in our own classrooms when I had one, and Richard now. So we're just going to go through some really practical ways of starting to introduce graphic novels and comics into your classroom practice.
Right, so the first one, using them to discuss empathy, I've kind of covered it a couple of times already and talked about it with some of those, but basically the mistake some people make is graphic novels are all superheroes or it's all high fantasy, but more and more they're becoming about real life situations or based on authors' upbringings and growing up, and they're drawing on their personal experiences, which gives a great medium to discuss them. So the examples there alone, you've got El Defo, which covers someone who's suffering from hearing loss. That's Smile, which covers the ordeal of getting braces, which so many people have to go through.
Yeah.
Stepping Stones, as I said, about families. And using these texts to either stimulate a discussion, to write about something, even just to sit down and say, actually, they've covered this. How do you feel about that? It really opens up children's eyes to people going through the same things. And also, I've noticed often they're more willing to discuss it because they've seen it represented. They feel happier to open up actually how they feel.
You can start talking about somebody else and then get on to how your own.
Exactly. It's almost that kind of, oh yeah, I'm now talking about myself thing. But they can really open that door. And for some children, they need that opened because they're not happy to talk about it if not.
Yeah. I think, definitely agree with that. So this is just a really quick practical idea. So a nice little activity that you can do, especially if you're working on focusing on building up speech in writing that conveys character or advances the action, because basically all the speech in a comic or graphic novel is meeting those 2 criteria, because there's so little space to include speech. It has to be either establishing the character or moving the action on. So a nice activity as a gateway to be able to do that in more written prose is to blank out some speech bubbles on a comic strip, and then get children to write in the dialogue that they think is happening. So it's an inference task using their understanding of both the sequence of images and the visual language within each image. But also really challenging them to think, I need Captain Haddock's voice to sound very different in writing than Tintin's. And I need what they're saying to move the images on, move the story on from one image to the next. And then you could move that on to writing this up in a paragraph of writing, but it's just a nice way to really get them to think about the content of the speech that they're writing, which we know is an outcome in Key Stage 2. But it's also a good way to make your writing interesting.
It's also just a really enjoyable way to cover speech.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, really fun. Oh, this is me as well. So another activity that I've done, it's not, so it's another reading skill of summarizing. And I found that sometimes children can find summarizing really difficult. They don't know how much to include or how little to include, where they have too much detail in or not enough. So actually using images to help scaffold that a little bit is really useful. So getting them to say, okay, so for example, this one is the first chapter. We're going to summarize the first chapter of The Explorer, Catherine Rundell. Can you tell me that story in 4 frames? And then, okay, what picture would you draw if I was just saying, tell me about that chapter in 3 frames? Or what pictures would you draw if, and think about what they leave out as they distill that information down into the key part. And then that can also be develop onto a written version, so 50 words, 20 words, 10 words, and thinking about each time really carefully about what information they're not going to include as they get more and more intense in their summarizing of the passage. And I think that it's just a really useful way. I think that they find it easier to do it in pictures to start with, honestly, oftentimes. So it's, and they if they've had exposure to comics and they understand the sequences of images, then that can be a great way to start that off.
Okay, so Scramble activities are quite simple. Basically, you take a select amount of panels. This one's 3, but it could be more, could be, well, you can't do it too much less, but, and you mix the order up and just get your pupils to do it. It could be they cut them out, you give them to them, cut out. You change the order and then you look at it. How does that change the meaning by doing that? Has it changed a character's role in the story? Has it changed their intentions? Has it changed anything, or is it still the same? Does it still make sense? If it doesn't, what would we, would it need to be a big change? Would it be simply changing a sentence? Would it be, we have to change a whole part? Okay, and then thinking about with how they've changed it, how does that change what's going to happen next in the story? So now they've moved the panels, does it change the next events, or does it change the events that have happened prior to this? And it really makes them think about the knock-on effect of their choices and makes them think about the language and what that tells us, rather than just, oh, well, it says that happens, so it does. Well, we can look at the body language, we can look at what's happening now. What does that tell us is going to happen or likely to happen? Thinking about character voices, that going to have an effect as well. And as we say, it can be, some people like to do it with a page that maybe has like 9-10 panels on, so you can really play with the timeline a lot. Some people will do a simple one like this, where you've only got 3, and you could maybe move just simply one of them and how that would change it. But it's really good for thinking about kind of critical thinking skills, and also just thinking about the structure of writing and the structure of their work, and how one little thing can change that quite significantly.
And this activity is actually included in the National Literacy Trust's comic rules unit of work, which is free to download on our website. And it's that this artwork is a Beano task from that unit of work. There's a link. We're going to send the slides around afterwards. So there's lots of free resources on using comics on there. Oh, this is another one.
So missing panel works on a similar style because you can move where it is. But basically the idea is you put a missing panel somewhere in a strip for the comic. So this one, we've got it at the end. You could put it in the middle, you could put it at the start. The idea is the children need to read through what is there and work out what should go in the missing one. Now that could involve looking at the preceding panels, the surrounding ones, what comes afterwards. It could be just thinking, right, what do I want to happen next based on what I've seen? But they've got to make sure they follow the right tone. They've got to make sure the characters, if they're characters speaking in the next one, that they don't all of a sudden change how they're speaking or how they would act. And it's got to follow on and make sense, or it's got to, if it's one that's at the beginning, it's got to make sure the following events will make sense and not just jump about too much without any sort of comprehension side for the reader. And you can change the challenge how you want. So it could be you start at one panel, then take out 2 or 3. A particularly difficult one is to remove the middle, because they've got to think about the pace the story moves at then as well. But again, following on from the Scramble activity, it looks heavily at that kind of thinking area, their critical thinking skills, actually the process involved in developing their writing. So what do I want to happen? What do I want to be the result, or what would cause this? And those things we need them to do that sometimes they don't always do. It kind of slows them down and forces them to go through one step at a time instead of jumping right to the end and everyone has a fight and then they have a party to celebrate. they've got to think about how they get there and what steps are required. So it can be really good for slowing them down and just making them think carefully and critically.
Yeah, I agree. So another thing that we can do, and I've done in classes, so I grew up on a diet of reading Tintin. I love Tintin, but I'm really aware as an adult that there are some problematic images in there. There's some representation issues in there, and I wanted to tackle that head on with my class if I was going to have those books in the classroom. So what we looked at was another really popular, always popular in classrooms that I've had, Akissi, Tales of Mischief, which is written by Marguerite Aboué, who and it's about growing up on the Ivory Coast, and it's just really funny and fun and Tales of Mischief. So we looked at the different quality of character when with it from in Tintin, when cultures are represented by people not from outside of those cultures. So we're looking at what's the difference in representation essentially with an own voice text versus a text like Tintin, where somebody is making judgments about a culture that they don't necessarily understand. And it was much easier to unpick that look for the children, I'm talking about year 5 in this instance, with their images to support them. So really sort of questions we were asking as we discussed it was, who's represented and how, which characters are given a voice. And you see down at the bottom there, the chief he's not saying anything, he's just got an exclamation mark in his speech bubble, he's not given a voice at all. Versus in Akissi, she's the main character, she's got her character has real depth, it's really complex, and just far better quality characterization. Which characters do we know most about, which have a backstory, you know, who has the writer really taken the time to develop, and is there an imbalance there? And what assumptions has the writer made? So for example, the assumption in this Tintin example is that the people in this culture do not know what a solar eclipse is, or that they haven't seen one before, or haven't had any records of that in their past, despite these kind of cultures being well documented to have an amazing record keeping, to the point where we still look at them you know, hundreds of years later and are able to find out things about their culture. So there's all of that history that is inaccurately represented, and so it's really interesting to actually just begin those discussions and start opening the door to becoming a critical reader and really thinking a bit more carefully about how people are represented and whether that is a true representation and whether it contains any bias, whether explicit or implicit. So it's an interesting activity to do, and I think that graphic novels can be a good way into that.
So this is following on from the empathy work I talked about earlier, but this is a really specific example that has been probably the most rewarding one I've done. And using guts, we looked at an extract, which we'll show you in sort of following slides. And we talked about it as a class. We had some basic questions on it, kind of comprehension style in an English lesson, but nothing, you know, too beyond just thinking about body language and vocabulary choices and those kind of things. But the finishing task and the final task for it was the key one. And
do you want me to move on the slides, Richard, so that they
yeah, you can do while I talk about that, but that's fine. So the scene sort of shows Raina, the character herself, going into a therapist's office to try and talk about some of the problems she's got. So the final task on it, which was aimed at developing children's answers and explanations, thinking about moving beyond just a single sentence, was really simple. It was about the idea of advice for people suffering from anxiety. So what advice would you give, or what advice have you been given that you think works? And what it did was it not only took away the stigma of it's not okay to worry, like it was like, it's fine, let's talk about it, actually, let's embrace it and see how we can help this. But it really gave those children who have struggled, who have helped others in the past, a voice to say, actually, I know about this, I've got some information that could help other people. And the conversations we had in my class during the time we were talking about that question was so mature. You know, they were children in year 5 and 6, but actually we had answers that I'd be expecting from children coming towards the end of kind of high school. And they all offered such sincere and genuinely incredibly helpful advice that most adults will ignore, but could really benefit from listening, because they were able to embrace that this wasn't a problem. They were able to say, actually, they want me to talk about this, they want me to be involved with it, they want me to kind of help with it. And lots of them looked at it in a really sensible manner. So we talked quite at length about what they can do for themselves, but more importantly as well, what they can do for others. And for some of them, it wasn't even solving the problem. It was just being able to say to someone, look, if you want help, just come and find me and I'll speak to you. So people were saying things, there's children who are 10 years old saying, I'm at the end of the telephone if you need me, which we've all been saying through lockdown, obviously, because people have said, oh, this is terrible. And they had it there for people ready and offering advice, things like breathing techniques, or offering, I think one child even just said, look, in life, there's going to be things that don't go your way. You've got to be prepared that that is part of it. However, if it's getting too much, go and get yourself some help. Don't let it overwhelm you, because this is going to be a problem you've got to tackle. And it really just took away the stigma and opened up the willingness to help. And that was so rewarding for me and for some of them to see that.
Imagine.
And it was all because of the book.
Yeah, I think I think we've really demonstrated how powerful it can be for starting conversations, which so accessible for everyone, and it really unlocks things for a lot of children. Quick one, writing. Sticky note comics and mini books is a really great way to get children writing. This is one that someone in my class wrote, Freddie and Bonbon, #1, how they met. It's the origin story of Freddie and Bonbon. So just really quick and accessible writing for pleasure activity. I think we should probably move on to we did start a bit late, but there we go, we're at it. Comics for beginners. So we're just going to do a really quick couple of minutes on some key vocab and some just different things that you can bear in mind when you're analysing comics, when you're having a bit more of an in-depth guided reading session on one, for example. So this is drawing on research by Laura Jimenez about how graphic novels are read, and she found that there are graphic novel expert readers, and if you're an expert reader, then you have certain behavior traits when you're reading, which can be interesting. Again, for those children maybe who are more able decoders, more high retaining decoders who would race through, read it like it's a book and not look at the pictures properly and get to the end very quickly. This can be a good way to actually, you've missed 60% of the information by just reading the words, because you haven't taken a look at the sequence and you haven't taken a look at the visual information. So what they tend to do is they skim the book and they look at the artwork and the genre and the style. So it's a quick flick through to begin with. And then they look really closely at the first page, the background, the setting and the time period. Example there of the Sean Tan book, The Arrival. You can really get a lot of information by just looking at that picture about the setting and the time. We can make a lot of inferences about it anyway, whether we're correct or not is another thing. Then they look at the characters and the mood. Again, I think these images from Sean Tan really establish the mood of the book really clearly. The colours used, and all of this is before reading a word. When they read the book, they read it several times, looking at different characters from different character perspectives and thinking about whether there's more than one story, looking at subplots. So it's that rereading. It's not just a start to finish, put it back on the shelf. And the words and the images push together to create a whole that is that achieves more than either one on their own, which I think is really important. So that's something that can be really good to prompt children. And we've got some key vocabulary which might help you have conversations with children about graphic novels and might help them to explain what it is that they're seeing or noticing. Were you going to go through this, Richard?
Yes.
If I press through, I've animated it.
Excellent. So the first one we've got, you'll see, is called a frame or a panel. That's simply just a single image selected. Okay. Panels is usually the term I'm familiar with, that some people may refer to as frame. And then if you've got them joined together, so at the top there, we can see you've got two next to each other, but that's not the complete page. We'd call that a tier. Gutters, they're the kind of space in between panels or down the middle of the page. Depending on the book, depending on the author and everything, will depend how the guttering is done. Some have big gutters for reasons. Some like to spill into the gutters at certain points. It's all
excitingly in Lightfall, sometimes the gutters go black.
Yes, and it's all a very personal choice. And actually, I find if an author does something with a gutter at some point, it can have a really big effect on you because it makes you notice something's going on.
Yeah.
And then splash page is what's used to refer to a double spread. Usually there'd be wordless or there'd be minimal words on this. We can see here we have sort of one tiny little bit of wording, which says I don't have time for friends. But a splash page is focusing on a scene or potentially a new setting can be a common one. Sometimes they're really dramatic and there's lots going on. Sometimes they're just beautifully illustrated and just give you that chance to kind of breathe and take stock of what's happened or going to happen potentially, depending on the authorial intent. And they can often be really good to analyze in the classroom or to look at and just think about all the little details in them.
Yeah. Just a quick one, which is that the artwork style can really impact the story. So I'm going to skim through this really quickly, but just to say that simple drawings can often help us to identify people. If it's a very simple, I've got some examples here. So you've got Sad Ghost Club, very simple. That character has their sheet over the whole entire time. You can't see who they are, and therefore it's much more easier to identify or to think about you being in that situation. So those very simple drawings of cartoons, often cartoon style drawing, often we find it easier to identify and put ourselves into that person, whereas really detailed drawings like a Sean Tan type style of illustration is more about really complicated, like complex world building, and you're thinking about things in a much broader way, and thinking about that person as separate from you and their experience as separate from your own. So that's a theory behind comic images. That might not be your experience as you're reading them. You might think, well, I don't really fit into that pattern, but that's something that people have said about reading comics. So I think it's interesting, maybe a thought-provoking question to ask children when we've got contrasting styles of artwork. So that is the end. We're just going to really quickly look at some resources that we've got available. This will be sent around, but on the end of these slides, there's lots of resources that are available on the National Literacy Trust website, Richard's, Padlet, which is an endless supply of graphic novels for you to spend your money on, Lucas Maxwell's podcast that I mentioned, some of the articles that I've referenced, and if you're really geeking out at the end, some really deep books about comic theory if you really want to get into it. So yeah, thank you for listening. I hope you found it interesting. Hi, Kathy.
Thank you very much.
Hi there. Thank you so much to both of you, Lucy and Richard. That was fascinating, actually.